Amen. So God's covenant with man following the flood, Genesis 9. So before we get to our lesson, I want to provide really an overview, maybe advance the story a little bit more over the last 3 weeks. So over the last 3 weeks, I've been building the case that between the scriptures and science, as we bring those together and understand the global catastrophe, in particular the fountains of the great deep bursting forth, and everything that follows that event, it is much worse, much more cataclysmic, much larger catastrophe than we ever imagined in our wildest imagination. Equally, as I built the case, much about our planet that we see today can only be understood by the global flood. Nothing else makes sense of many enigmas we see on our planet today. Today, I want to make some final comments before I leave this topic because I can't leave it alone, hoping to answer maybe any lingering questions you may have as we've talked about catastrophic plate tectonics, as we've talked about the thrusting up of the mountains as we see them, as we've talked about the mid-oceanic ridge, as we've talked about the fountains of the great deep bursting forth and what that might have looked like, and the devastation it wreaked on this planet. It is the genesis for most of the fossils we find on the planet today. It is the genesis for the massive coal, oil, and methane reserves we find on our planet today. It explains why the continents look like they look, where they came from. The mid-oceanic ridge and Noah's flood brings sense to all this. Not Pangea, that's not even close. Pangea makes no sense. But when you understand the catastrophe that was Noah's flood and the things we've talked about up till now, all of these things come together to make sense. Now, for those who are brand new with us, the last 2 weeks we've talked about many of these things, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, just check out the first 20 minutes or so of the last lessons, 14, 15, and 16 probably. And that'll give you a lot about what science is pointing to, the scriptures tells us, but science shows us happened at the catastrophe that is the flood. Now, if we go back to where I started, we speculated, based on the scriptures and science, that the pre-flood world was likely one large supercontinent, likely had smaller oceans, smaller mountains, much more lush vegetation. You'll see more of that this morning. And I said possibly there was a water vapor, or ice canopy. That is a possibly, and we get that idea from day 2 in creation. Sorry. We're not sure. Again, if there was, there's been great research done. It could not be any thicker than 40 feet of water. Any thicker than that would overheat the planet. But it could easily be that. We saw the exhaust from our space shuttle actually floats in our mesosphere, frozen. But all this together, as you bring all this together, created atmospheric conditions that were much different than we see on our planet today. If there was a canopy, the atmospheric pressure would have been higher because of the canopy. O2 levels would have been higher across the planet. It would have created a situation where many harmful rays from the sun, X-rays, gamma, neutrinos, etc., would have been blocked, possibly contributing to the long life that we saw in the patriarchs. And in fact, if we talk about it, it was 912.3 years on average, including Noah, factoring out Enoch, because the Lord translated him. They were living a very long time. When you think about that today, man is lucky if he makes 100, a ninth of what was normal, to use that word. And it's probably not just man that was living those long lives, it was likely the animals too. Now, as you think about this from the scriptures and peek outside the Bible for just a second, I want to talk to you about the atmosphere. The massive insects we find in the fossil record could not have lived in today's atmosphere. That's not Rich's opinion, that's science fact. In fact, this is from World Magazine. You can see the title of the article, Bugged Out. And this article talks about how insects do not have lungs. This is funny, it came up in the early class somehow. But instead, they breathe through holes in their exoskeletons, and that allows air to enter this network of trachea tubes, and that's how they live. Now, the trachea tubes can't get too big, or the structure of the bug breaks down. And so they're puzzling, how are they bigger with small tubes? How did that work? And here's what they came to. However, if the atmosphere's oxygen level was greater in the past, as science believe it was, 31% to 35% compared to today's 21%, and by the way, you have these notes in your notes, the tracheal tubes may have been able to support larger bodies while remaining relatively small. Now, this should cause you to think, okay, I didn't know science thought the oxygen level was 35% at one time. Why was it so different? When did it change? What caused it to change? Now, we know the answers to those questions, but those are legitimate questions if you believe this, and indeed they do. As you continue on with this thought, and that's just the quote. This comes from New Scientist, March. You can see 50% more oxygen than it does now. They found that it was 32% oxygen compared to 21%. Now, if you read this whole article, what they're musing over is how the dinosaurs could have survived. Here's the reason. Their nostrils are too small to keep them alive. They're like, how does, like a brontosaurus, we'll look at him in a second, how could he live? His nostrils are the same size as a horse. He's 100 foot long. If you stood next to him when he breathed in, did you get sucked up? Gone? Well, and what they determined through looking at air bubbles caught in fossilized amber is that the oxygen level was between 32 to 35% compared to today's 21%. That's not speculation. That's multiple times they've determined this. By the way, this amber also has a fossilized fly. You get that at no additional charge. But again, you see what they're doing. They're pulling that air out of that bubble that was caught when this amber rolled down the tree and captured the air that existed at that time. And what they're finding is that the O2 level was much higher. And again, this isn't Rich's opinion. This is science wrestling with this problem. Here's the brontosaurus, the apatosaurus. Again, his nostrils were the size of a horse. How did this guy breathe? How did he live? He lived because he lived in a much more friendly environment than he found himself in when he came off the ark. That's how he lived. The environment was changing radically when he came off the ark. And that explains some things to us. This is from Thaxton and Bradley. Quote, the only trend in recent literature is the suggestion of far more oxygen in the early atmosphere than anyone imagined. This isn't Rich's opinion. This is science's opinion. This is straight from National Geographic Online. They're dealing with how did these bugs get so big? Again, we talked about Bugged Out article. They're dealing with it. And you can see what they come to. The leading theory is that ancient bugs got big because they benefited from a surplus of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Oh, and by the way, a new study suggests it's possible to get too much oxygen, thus their bodies had to grow big. The oxygen levels demanded they grow big. Again, this is not Rich's opinion. This is modern science. As we look at science, it tells us that the environment when Noah lived, the environment when the dinosaurs roamed the planet, was very different the environment we have today. And that's not Rich's opinion. That's science. Anybody know what that is? That's great. That is a actual fossil of a dragonfly. You know what's different about that dragonfly? A 50-inch wingspan. You would have heard that dragonfly coming. Like you guys have been out on my dock and the dragonflies will be out there in the estuary. You would hear this one coming. He would sound like a Huey.
Rich is the size of the dragonfly.
That dragonfly, that may be about right. Again, that's right out of the fossil record. What about that? An 18-inch cockroach. Yeah, so much for grabbing a paper towel and grabbing that guy, huh? Again, we're laughing, but don't miss the takeaway. The pre-flood atmosphere was drastically different than what we see today. What we think is normal is not at all normal. It was very different what Noah experienced pre-flood than what we have today. And the fossil record screams it, and modern science even declares it. What about that? Anybody know what that is? It's tough. I know it's tough. It is a fossil. It's a 1-inch flea. Now, picture this. So when Rover comes out of the backyard and drops a couple of fleas in your carpet, you'll be able to find them now. No need to worry. Rover, I found 4 fleas. Did you do that? What I want you guys to see, we're laughing and cutting up, right? It's a little fun. I want you to be assured that the things I'm talking about, this different atmosphere, this canopy, and all these things, Rich is not just speculating and dreaming and pretending. Modern science is pointing to a world that was very different prior to Noah's flood. And there's no doubt about it. These things can't get this large anymore. And it's the atmosphere, it's the change in the conditions. So as we process all this, as we talk about all of this, let me get my notes caught up. This explains what we've been looking at in our genealogy chart, right? We've watched these pre-flood lives over 900 years, and then we watch the lives drop off after the flood. In fact, as you look at this, Noah was the last patriarch to live over 900 years old. He went through the flood. Everyone after him started to live shorter lives. Shem, 900 and something, 912.3 on average to 600, and it keeps going down all the way to Joseph, who lived 110, which, by the way, we would call that a good long life nowadays. What changed? Lots changed. Lots changed. When you look out here, it wasn't like this. We have undergone a global catastrophe of epic proportions. It was a different place. When Noah stepped out of the ark, it was a different place. Science is screaming it was a different place. The Bible is screaming it was a different place. Some of the changes were immediate, some took time. No doubt all the harmful rays and all the harmful radiation from the sun, that's going to take time to build up defects in the human genome that are going to impact us down the road. Question in the back.
Any idea why people aren't bigger, or were people bigger then?
As far as we know, people were not bigger back then. Keep in mind, we're all dealing with the limitations that God has programmed within our DNA. If, like reptiles, He's programmed the ability to grow bigger over time, then guess what happens is those reptiles live a long time. They continue to grow big until they hit whatever the DNA max is that God has programmed within their genome. For humans, that we have no idea other than the giants who roam the land, but they weren't like 100 feet. We're talking 9 or 10 feet. We're not talking 40 feet. So we were principally the same size, but the earth was a very different place. But we were living a lot longer. So we weren't so much bigger, we were living much longer. And I'm not talking 100 to 200, 100% increase. I'm talking 900 and something to less than 100. Now, as you look at this chart, you sort of take this in. I love this chart to see the overlap of people's lives, right? Because you see that, wow, so Adam was alive for 1, 2, you just chase the generations. But as we're talking about lifespan, I want you to see another chart. So the red line is the flood. I just kind of drop it in the middle of Noah's life there. Look at Shem. Automatically down from Noah way up there. Then it kind of flattens, it just continues down. Just over a handful of generations. Now, the truth is, if we were to factor out COVID today, we're probably starting to pick up a little life expectancy. We're probably, bumping from the high 70s, maybe into the 80s, but we're never going back here again. It's a totally different world now. And we have all new problems that we're dealing with because of the totally different world now. And so all the improvements in medicine and all the improvements in technology are not going to reverse this cycle. God has already reversed this cycle. And again, this might have been part of the 120 years are determined on you because man's evil and he can't live any longer. But again, I just want you to see this graphically. All that science is saying around our atmosphere, what the Bible is showing us, all of this pointing to one really big reality. So the bottom line, the atmospheric conditions were much different on the earth, and the Bible predicts all of these things we're seeing. It predicts we should see indicators of a totally different atmosphere when we look back in time. Now, we talked about ages, and so I won't go any further on that. Talked about the rapid decline. Now, next, as we talked about the pre-flood earth, we talked about the surface. I now want to just remind you of what we talked about below the surface. If you remember, we talked about subterranean water caverns. We said probably 3/4 of a mile to a mile deep below the crust. The crust would have been 10 to 50 miles deep. Again, these are water in interconnected chambers connected to the mantle. And you're thinking, well, how did that ever happen? Well, keep in mind, if we go back to creation on day 3, day 1, God created the earth, water-covered globe, covered by water, spinning in space, illuminated by the glory of God. God said, let there be light, and there was. On day 3, it tells us that God gathered the waters together so that dry land could appear. Now, Warren, in my mind, the waters are already gathered together. They're covering the whole surface of the planet. You can't gather them any more together than that. What theologians believe is that God gathered water together in subterranean water chambers, and in doing that, it caused dry land to appear, left smaller oceans on the top of the planet. You think, wow, where would we get that idea? Multiple places in the Psalms give us that very idea. Psalm 24, Psalm 33, Psalm 136. God founded the earth on the waters. God foundationed the earth on the seas. God gathered the water together in storehouses. All of those things are pointing to what he likely did on day 3, and it was that water that was the main genesis for the water that was used by God to destroy this planet. Now, again, we said that subterranean water chamber would have been 3/4 of a mile to a mile thick. Now, when you say a mile thick, that doesn't sound very deep. Gee, it's just a mile. Well, let me express it differently. It's 5,280 feet of water. Does that sound deep? I can't go swimming in 5,280 feet. It sounds very deep. This would have been a massive water interconnected chamber connected with columns to the mantle below the crust. That's likely what our planet looked like. That's the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. And again, if you're new to this, ladies, you want to check out the first parts of 14, 15, and 16 where I really deal with some of these things. Today is really just a sort of closing reminder about it all. If you remember, as we thought about this, and again, this is not done to scale. This would have been 10 to 60 miles thick. This would have been just a mile thick. This is just done for effect. It was the only video I could find, to be honest with you. But as we walk through this, failure in the crust would have began as a microscopic crack. Whether it was initiated because the pressure had exceeded some level or was initiated by God, doesn't matter. It was initiated as the scriptures declare. This fracture formed in these subterranean chambers traveled up through the crust. Once it hit the surface, it began to propagate in 2 directions, encircling our globe in probably about 3 hours as it traveled at the speed of sound and granite. And imagine water under the massive pressure of the overbearing crust is going to begin to jet through this crack. It's going to begin to shear granite, sand, dirt, pebbles, rocks, and boulders. And this material, in large part, is ejected into our atmosphere, forming some of the fossils immediately that we find. Some of it even ejected beyond our atmosphere. I talked about the destructive nature of that water pressure. I'll show it to you today. But it would have been shredding and pulverizing granite crust. Now, as you say that, you're probably thinking, Rich, that's a little hard to imagine. Don't worry, I'll show you. But as we look at our planet, it's the mid-oceanic ridge, the longest mountain range on our planet. Average height, 6,600 feet. It's below our ocean. It is the source of the catastrophic plate tectonics. It shows us where the rip occurred. It is where the continent slid from as it rose. It answers all the questions. It explains why the mountain ranges are parallel from the ridge in which they slid. It explains why it looks like the continents are connected together, because when you slide them into the ridge, they're perfectly connected together. Once you factor out the material that would have been blasted into the atmosphere and dropped all over the planet. It's this picture that really explains what happened at the global catastrophe, not Pangea, a catastrophe that happened in Noah's flood. Now, I realize when I say things like water ripping apart granite material, like that's a little far-fetched, Rich. Granite's I got some on my countertop, pretty tough. You've got miles thick of it, and you want me to believe that water just shredded it. Once a crack started, water just began to tear it apart. That's a little hard to believe. Well, I want to take you to a place. So this is Glen Canyon Dam, located on the Colorado River right outside of Page, Arizona. Let me give you some numbers to play with so that when we get to the video, you understand. Now, obviously, this dam is meant to, it creates electricity. That's its first big thing. It blocks the water, controls the water out, and creates electricity in the process. The total dam height is 710 feet. So if you were to fill this up brimming, you wouldn't want to go much further. It would go over the top of the dam and tear it down. But again, if you were to fill it up with brimming, the water pressure at the bottom would be over 300 pounds per square inch above the water pressure at the top due to the height of the column. A little over 300 pounds per square inch. Now that's minuscule, but that's actually a lot. That's minuscule compared to 10 to 60 miles of granite sitting on top of the water. This is just the weight of the water column itself. This is nothing, but it gives you the idea. So I want you to see this video because this will answer the power of water, and this is a small example.
A modern example of rapid erosion of bedrock from cavitation comes from Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River just above the Grand Canyon. Excessive snowfall from the high country of the upper Colorado River Basin in late spring of 1983 caused excessive runoff that poured into Lake Powell at rates of up to 148,000 cubic feet per second. This rapid inflow threatened to overflow Glen Canyon Dam. To control the high flow rates, the power plant was run at full capacity, releasing 28,000 cubic feet per second through the turbines. Then the outlet tubes were opened to drain another 17,000 cubic feet per second. This was still not enough. The emergency situation required engineers to risk damage to the spillway tunnel. And on June 15, the 40-foot diameter left spillway tunnel was opened to drain an additional 13,000 cubic feet per second, which was then raised to 17,000 cubic feet per second. Then on June 28, the flow was increased to 32,000 cubic feet per second. At this point, the water exiting the tunnel became red, and noticeable ground vibrations, earthquakes, were felt by engineers. Large blocks of concrete and bedrock came hurling from the 40-foot diameter tunnel. After closing the spillway tunnel, the survey team discovered extensive cavitation damage. The 3-foot thick steel reinforced concrete lining of the tunnel was penetrated by huge pits. At an elbow where the tunnel levels out, a hole 32 feet deep, 150 feet long, and 40 feet wide was cut through the lining into red sandstone bedrock. This hole required 63,000 cubic feet of concrete to fill. The repair process to the enormous hole shows the vast extent of the damage. The speed of erosion in the Glen Canyon Dam spillway tunnel occurred very rapidly during the period when the red color of water appeared and ground vibrations were generated. It is possible that cavitation was pulverizing concrete, steel, and sandstone at the rate of 1,000 cubic feet per second during the peak period of erosion.
1,000 cubic feet per second. Now, increase that pressure substantially, apply that across the globe, and you have an idea of what I'm talking about when a crack developed in the granite, that crack propagated to the surface and then began to tear its way in both directions. And what that would have looked like as water ejected out of the fountains of the great deep into and beyond our atmosphere. We are talking a catastrophe larger than we're imagining. We're talking a catastrophe that's burying some animals who are close to the slit immediately, while others are getting rained on with mud and sand and they're fighting their way to survive. This was an epic disaster. You see, it's the fountains of the great deep that are the genesis for the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It's the fountains of the great deep and the shredding of the granite that is the result of why we have over a mile of sedimentary rock on average across the face of our planet. Where did that come from? How did we get a mile of sedimentary rock on top of the granite? Noah's flood is the answer to all these enigmas we see. It is the rapid, catastrophic plate tectonics as water is shedding the granite crust. And again, this is not to scale 1 mile of water, 10 to 50 miles of crust. We talked about how this created the catastrophic plate tectonics. It's not Pangea. That doesn't work. The continents don't fit together that way. We don't have to shrink Africa by 35%. We bring the continents up against a distance away from the mid-oceanic ridge. It's there they slide, and all of a sudden, all of this makes sense. It explains why the mountain ranges are where they are. It makes sense of what everything we look at on our planet and why we see it the way we see it. You see, it started as a totally different planet. And the catastrophe, the bursting forth of the fountains of the great deep, changed everything. Now, I talked about coal, oil, methane formation. Now, as most of you know, maybe all of you know, coal is organic. It's plant material. It's formed by plants that are buried in the presence of water rapidly. We can reproduce it in the lab. We can produce coal in the lab. We fully understand the circumstances and situations needed to make coal. We can make it in the lab. Not a problem. I want to show you some coal pockets that defy evolutionary explanation. I want to show you some, because again, this is plant material. So picture coal is you're gonna throw down some trees, Jay, bury them fast in the presence of water, come back in millions of years and you'll have coal. That's the evolutionary idea. Okay, so I want to show you something, and when we're done, I want you to explain to me how we got these pockets of coal. Because here's the picture I want you to have in your mind. As this flood is tearing apart the earth, it's also ripping and shredding vegetation, which floats. It's piling that vegetation up. It's burying that vegetation in massive blocks of vegetation because of the tidal effects of the moon and even to a minor degree the sun. All of this is happening as water is tearing our planet apart. And so this time I want to take you to the Powder River Basin. This is actually this video comes from Eagle Butte Mine. It's a coal mine. It's part of a larger, what's called the Powder River Basin coal formation. And so we'll talk about how was this formed after we watch the video.
The Amax Eagle Butte open pit mine near Gillette, Wyoming, exposes the vast coal reserves made visible by the strip mining methods used here. The Eagle Butte mine boasts of coal layers or seams with thicknesses ranging up to 120 feet. Eagle Butte mine is part of a much larger coal-rich area known as the Powder River Basin. This gigantic 10,000 square mile reserve, situated between the Black Hills of South Dakota on the east and the Bighorn Mountains on the west, extends northward to the Yellowstone River in Montana and southward to Casper, Wyoming. The immensity of the Powder River Basin coal deposits has attracted the attention of geologists for decades. Such interest was documented in the May 1993 issue of Earth magazine. The article, Powder River Coal, Geologic Enigma, Environmental Dilemma, included these statements. Powder River's coal seams run remarkably thick and unsullied by other material. Usually, unwanted sediment such as clay washes over a deposit before coal seams can get very thick. But Powder River coal is packed in immense strips, some more than 200 feet thick. These seams stretch vast distances up and down the basin. They're hundreds of miles long. They're 50 miles wide, says James McClurg, a geologist at the University of Wyoming. They're not little pods of an acre or two. They're immense things. McClurg, who studied the basin for more than a decade, says no other place in the world has as many seams 50 feet or more thick. But the Powder River Basin is not only an economic resource. To geologists, it's also an intriguing scientific enigma. Geologists have been studying the basin for more than a century, largely to answer a baffling question. How did the seams get so massive? Or more precisely, why weren't the seams diluted by influxes of clay and other impurities before they thickened? As McClurg puts it, how on earth did things remain constant enough so that you can get 200 feet of coal? The genesis of any kind of coal demands a precise sequence of events, however. If you don't get all of them, you don't get coal, explains McClurg. And to get seams more than 200 feet thick, low in impurities and low in sulfur is a remarkable achievement. He adds, it would be like blindfolding yourself, spinning around and hitting the center of a dartboard 100 times in a row.
10,000 square miles. What in the world could have created this? That's the question. Science is baffled. Noah's flood answers how we can uproot this much vegetation, deposit it in one place, and bury it, smashed all together with very little clay influxed into the coal as it forms. And no other answer makes any sense. There's no way to make it happen. Forests don't grow thick like that. Trees don't grow together. You see, Noah's flood, as I keep saying, answers many enigmas on our planet that make no sense apart from a global catastrophe of epic proportions as outlined in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. Nothing else answers the mail. I can't think of a single situation, neither can they. He said it's like blindfolding yourself and spinning around and then hitting the center of a dartboard while you're blindfolded 100 times. I think most of us would probably call that impossible, and that's what he's saying. But it's not impossible. It's very possible. It's here on the planet. And the Bible answers to why it's on the planet. But there's something else I want to show you as well, and that's fossil graveyards. Now, I meant to bring a trilobite this morning. I forgot, Sandy. I was going to bring my trilobite fossil, and we could let people look at him. But so I apologize for that. No show and tell this morning. I planned it, but you won't get it. Now, these are trilobites, lived many years ago, obviously lived during Noah's flood. They were bottom scavengers. Some of them are very beautiful, very exquisite eyes. They're very complex creatures. Now, as you might imagine, trilobites did not live like that. They didn't live like stacked all over each other. You see, what we find when we look at the fossil record is sometimes we find graveyards of animals. This is an example of one of the types of graveyards we find. Sometimes we'll find like a certain animal type, like land animals or aquatic animals, and they'll be like clumped together, like they were caught in some kind of sweeping disaster and buried, like Noah's flood. Sometimes we find where land animals would be mixed with prey and predator, almost like they were fleeing together. They stopped worrying about who's going to eat whom, and they're just trying to survive, and they're buried together. Sometimes we find beds where different animal types, aquatic and land, are all mixed together, oftentimes all shredded up, like a leg of this animal and a horn of this animal and a fish fin of this animal, all spun together and buried. What? They didn't live like that, Warren. What type of disaster would create that type of fossil bed? So I want to talk to you about really just a few. The first one is the Ashley fossil beds in South Carolina. It's an enormous phosphate graveyard that contains mixed remains of man with land and sea animals, dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, whales, sharks, rhinos, horses, mastodons, mammoths, porpoises, elephants, deer, pig, dogs, and sheep. This catalog of fossils from the phosphate beds was given by Major Edward Willis, who displayed examples as he toured the United States. In his book, Fossils and the Phosphate Specimens, and by the way, you have these in your notes, written in 1881, Professor F.S. Holmes, a paleontologist and curator of the College of Charleston's Natural History Museum, described the fossil graveyard like this, as he explained it to the Academy of Natural Sciences. Quote, remains of hog, the horse, and other animals of recent date, together with human bones, mingle with the bones of the mastodon, and extinct giant lizards are found buried there together and fossilized. Now, he called them extinct gigantic lizards. That's because he wrote in 1881. The word dinosaur was not even invented until 1876, so it had just been invented, and he was still calling what they called them then big lizards. But these big lizards with all types of things, including man, are found there in the Ashley fossil bed in South Carolina. Let's be honest, they didn't live like this. This is what the destruction of the flood left them looking like. I'll give you another one. This is Agate Springs in Nebraska, a fossil graveyard that contains, as best they can tell, about 9,000 different animals. laid down, covered with sedimentary rock, the remains of 100 rhinos, three-toed horses, camels, giant wild boars, birds, plants, trees, seashells, and fish are all intermingled together in a massive, confusing graveyard, as if they were swept and churned and buried. One more. Another massive repository of fossils is found in South Africa. Now, we can only speculate the number of creatures here. One mind-boggling analysis comes from Richard Milner in his book, Encyclopedia of Evolution, Humanity's Search for Its Origins. He is no Christian. He believes in evolution. He's talking about what he finds here in the Karoo Formation. Here's what he says. Not my words, his. Quote, the Karoo Formation in South America alone contains fossil remains of about 800 million animals, buried, swept together. Speak, Lord, for your servant here. Here is the point. All of these fossil graveyards point us back to Genesis. They point us back to the catastrophe that we've been talking about. They explain there's no other explanation to create these things, as well as the massive number of animals. And that is really the point. But I do want to show you one other thing, and I want you to explain to me how this might have come to be.
For all the new people, that was the air conditioner going on. It's a really weird system, so it sounded like a cannon going off, but it was just the air conditioner coming on. That's it.
Thank you, brother. So let me give you a little background. This is an ichthyosaur. This is an ancient extinct marine reptile, much like a bottlenose dolphin if you were to see one. That's what he kind of looked like. And this ichthyosaur, as you can tell, is having a baby. Okay, this ichthyosaur has been fossilized, caught in the very act of giving birth. Thank you. And in fact, so close, you can see the baby ichthyosaur is almost out of the birth canal. Haley, he almost made it. This guy almost made it. Now, I want you to think with me through the situation that would have resulted in this through evolutionary understandings. This ichthyosaur is swimming along, and it has a massive heart attack as it's having the baby. No problem. That makes sense to me. It sinks to the bottom of the ocean floor. Now, during this entire process, amazingly enough, the little baby, which is only connected by the front of his little bottlenose face, doesn't make it out. In spite of mom laying there, he doesn't escape. And he must, Dean, just die there as well. What happens next is even more amazing. The currents. Apparently there are none, Dean, because they don't pull the little baby apart. The baby just lays there, right? Barely connected to the mother. Ocean currents, water currents. I guess it was none more. Good news. Don't pull it apart. Better news. Scavengers don't come along with this fresh baby ichthyosaur having just been birthed by mom and tear this whole thing apart. Rather, it just lays here on the ocean floor. And slowly, here we go, over tens and hundreds and thousands, indeed millions of years, sediment slowly carries this animal. Good news, it doesn't rot amazingly as it lays here on the bottom of the ocean. It's just perfectly preserved, and here we find it as a fossil, and what an amazing find. I have to be honest with y'all, that is a fairy tale. That is not how it works at all. This ichthyosaur happened to be caught in the very act of having a baby ichthyosaur when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and mud and rock and silt begin to rain down on the water where this little lady fish was having her child. She was instantly buried. He never stood a chance. She never stood a chance. There was no movement. They were buried right to the bottom of the ocean floor instantly. And we find them as we dig them up today. An amazing fossil. Yeah, Jack. Jack has a question for the mic.
Rich, I'm amazed that we are getting this geologic lesson today when there are thousands of archaeologists who are digging up things, telling us things are 1 million years old. How does this message not get into our geography books, our history books? Are people looking at this explanation that you are showing that other scientists have said and just ignoring it or dismissing it? Or how does this not get into the mainstream of our education system?
It's a great question, Jack. And when you deny the existence of God, whatever the final answer is never going to include God. So when you look at this, or you look at the fossil graveyards, or you look at the coal formation, and you go, wow, this is amazing. This is like blindfolding someone and spin them around 100 times, or spin them around, and then they hit a dartboard right in the bullseye 100 times. This is astounding. But you never go, you know, the Bible talked about a flood, a cataclysm where water covered this earth. The Bible described a planet that was built to be inhabited. Currently, and we're going to go to John next, so get ready with Mike. Currently, the planet is 71% water and 29% land. I would submit to you, before the flood, it was probably just the opposite. It was probably 71% land and 29% water. As we look at coal formations like this, we cannot imagine that much vegetation on our planet now. You know why? Because it's not. It was then, though. It was then, but it was a totally different environment.
Do the evolutionists, do they deny that there was a flood, or just that God created the flood?
Yeah, so great. So, and now I'm going to speak broadly for people. So whenever you try to categorize people, you're going to fail. So I'm off on a fool's errand already. But let me be honest. There are many Christians who deny a global flood. Okay? I would argue the science screams there's a global flood. And when you read the Bible, multiple times he destroyed, he blotted out, he wiped out everything that had the breath of life because of man's sin. So I would argue the Bible screams of a global catastrophe that took the life of everything that dwelled on the face of the planet, with the exception of those who were on the ark. And science screams the exact same thing. The Bible describes a creation that was lush and much different than we have today, with a planet, as Isaiah describes, that was made to be inhabited, and we now have a planet that's made to be swam in, almost. But now for evolutionists, they will, of course, and I lost you for a second, I couldn't find it. They will, of course, admit local floods. But yeah, they would outright, as far as I know, deny a global flood.
I'm not sure if we've mentioned, but 240-something cultures have a flood story in their history, including Hawaii,
Chinese.
all over the place.
Yeah, so if you were at the Creation Museum, you saw that little area that was set up for all the cultures that have flood stories. And so you begin to ask yourself, well, why do all these different cultures have flood stories? Because there was a flood. I mean, this becomes very simple to understand. Why do all these cultures have flood stories? Because as Shem, Ham, and Japheth left the ark, as the population began to explode, as the people were divided at Babel, guess what every culture carried with them? A story of a flood. Only one was preserved by God. Only one was superintended by God. Only one was superintended, as God may have explained additional thing to Moses when he wrote Genesis. So all the other ones contain some truth, where we have the Bible superintended by God that contains the truth. But the reason that all cultures, or many cultures, 240 plus, have a flood story is because there was a flood. I'll give you one more and we'll move on to another point. Why do most cultures have stories about dragons? Because there were large lizards that roamed the planet that men fought getting off the ark. Now, those large lizards faced very difficult situations when they came off the ark. The atmosphere was changing, degrading to what we see today. They were destined to lose the battle. Man was going to take them out, and the atmosphere was wiping them out. But the reason these cultures have stories of dragons is because there was a time when man and dinosaurs lived together. And if you doubt that, go read the book of Job. Go look at Behemoth. No doubt what he is. Any other questions? This was all like my final points about the reality of a global flood, the catastrophe, the power of water, the formation of coal, all those things that might be out there in your head that I haven't touched upon that I wanted to get to before we get back in Genesis, because I want you to walk away after our 3 weeks kind of touching on this on and off. Okay, that was much worse than I've ever imagined. This was a catastrophe that I never even considered. This explains why we find fossils everywhere. This explains the fossil graveyards. This explains the coal formation. This explains the oil formation, which, by the way, is animals. This explains all of these things that don't make sense how they got together otherwise. This explains the mid-oceanic ridge, the mountain range that wraps around our planet underwater and under North America. This explains so many things.
I have to say thanks, because up until 3 weeks ago, I never heard any of this. It's amazing, all this stuff, and never heard a word, and now hear all this stuff, and it makes total sense. So thank you for sharing all this with us, because it's cool.
Rich, how do we teach this to our grandchildren?
No, it is a valid point. Next week, so I have a wonderful textbook put out by Dr. Walt Brown that deals with this theory in its totality. It is a textbook. It's called In the Beginning or something like that, right? I gave it to you in digital format. I gave it to the leaders in digital format. What I will do is, that textbook is available online free. I'll bring a hard copy so that you can see it. But you can access that textbook, Dr. Walt Brown, In the Beginning, I think is the name of the textbook. It deals with all of this and more. I've just been giving you guys samples because we're not here to talk about science. We're here to talk about the scriptures. But I need you to see that the scriptures are saying something that science says is absolutely true. You don't need to go, whoa, that sounds a little hard to believe. Is it amazing at some points? Absolutely. And science is screaming all of it is true. But we knew it was true beforehand, didn't we? It's the Word of God.
Okay, and so science says hundreds of millions of years.
So check
No,
out my
it's not
videos on
that yet.
radiometric dating and carbon-14 dating. They're both up in the miscellaneous documents area. I would argue every vein of science, when rightly understood, screams this earth is young. When we go and like potassium argon date lava flows. So we're talking about lava flows we know the data of. Like we've watched the lava come out of the tube, flow down the mountain, run over the highway. We go and date it. We know the date it happened. It happened 50 years ago. We date that lava, and it brings back dates, potassium argon, of 1.3 million years old. And you know what science does? Well, we know that's not right. But overall, potassium argon dating is correct. So let's take the logic here. When I date the date of something I know the age of and get a wrong date, that's fine. When I date the age of something I don't know the date of, I believe that date to be true. Does that make sense to anyone in the room? And you don't have to be a Christian to go, that doesn't make sense. Here's what you will find, and please check out the 2 videos in the miscellaneous documents. I spent 2. In the Beginning, you can Google it and find it, Dr. Walt Brown. He talks about, he calls these continents on water hydroplates. But his whole theory is based on the Bible. You see, he goes to the Bible. What is the Bible describing? Now I bring that forward and make sense out of it. You know, I showed you the rock, and if you haven't seen the video, you need to check it out. It's, I think, lesson 14, the rock on the moon that came from Earth. Right? Remember that? He predicted that the fountains of the great deep would be so strong that they would launch material from the Earth into space. So everyone, and NASA didn't tell us for 49 years that there was an Earth rock on the moon, but everybody goes, wow, how'd that Earth rock go on the moon? Well, he didn't say you'll find an Earth rock on the moon, but he had already predicted that material from the Earth would be jettisoned into space. And you'll see he makes a number of predictions about that material as it flies around our solar system right now.
Since you're about to leave the subject.
I'm about to leave this
did you
subject and
ever-
never come back.
Did you ever mention about the Pacific Ocean, how that inverted in because of how a ball that if you put pressure on one side,
I
that's
did
why
not.
the basin is so small, and then you have all those volcanic, okay.
So she just lures me into these additional discussions that I didn't plan on making.
Well, you talked a lot about the mid-oceanic ridges we can see from the front, but that Pacific, I just wanted you to mention that.
So as you look at the Pacific Basin, the one thing that jumps out is the Ring of Fire. It's wrapped by volcanoes. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Where's my clicker? Thank you, brother. That's a good point. Let me see how far I have to go back to get it. I don't know where it's at, but there it is. Okay. You see all of this up here? That's the Ring of Fire. What that is the Pacific Plate subducted. when the mid-oceanic ridge, which was the other 2/3 of the planet, when that ridge rose, melting rock behind it, and thrust that out to compensate for the rock that is just left, the 10 to 60 miles of granite, the equalizing force that's now gone, it pops up. Guess what happens? It subducts that entire plate. And we're already starting to find evidence of subducted plates across our planet. And he predicted this before we ever had any hint that there was a subducted plate, and then pulled in. So rather than the plate being split open as this one was, as you think about Europe and North America and South America, the mid-oceanic ridge popping up to keep the equilibrium sunk the Pacific plate and created the ring of fire because it melted rock when it subducted that plate, and the ring of fire wraps that subducted plate. Can I buy a vowel?
I told him not to use such a big words like that, but he keeps doing it. One more thing since you're going to leave the subject, and I meant to ask you about this at home. Do you remember the Chinese symbol for boat?
No.
It's like eight.
It's like eight people and something else.
I know.
So Chinese symbols are made up of multiple symbols, and I believe, so write this down, Laurel, because Sandy's lured me in this action, so now I have to tell you the truth next week. I believe the symbol is 8 people. I'm not sure. I'll owe the class the answer. I don't remember.
Rich, I think they just found a lost continent.
New Zealand land.
No, this is a new one that was subducted underneath Europe. It's like Argo land or something.
Don't know. I don't know about Argo land. That one I don't know about. But anything else, before we leave this subject, this topic, again, I apologize for so much science right here at the early part. But I really wanted to get some final things out in case you're still out there going, I'm just having problems with global flood. The Bible's screaming global flood. The earth is screaming global flood. Wherever you look in science, it is screaming global flood. John, thank you.
This might be too trivial for you to spend time on, but when we talk about water shooting up through this crack in the planet, and so strong that it's pushing continents around, I'm picturing what would be left would be a giant canyon instead of a giant mountain ridge.
It is. You're picturing exactly correct. This is the massive canyon that's left. Now, here's the question. So I'm going to answer the question. I don't know it next week. We Googled it. Didn't Google awesome? So here we go. Chinese symbol for boat is vessel, 8, and mouth, as in 8 mouths in a vessel. That's the Chinese symbol for boat. Now, why would the Chinese symbol have anything to do with the number 8? Because it's all connected back to the flood, right? So when they made this symbol, they're thinking boat, and they connected it with the 8 that were on the boat that saved them from the global catastrophe that was the flood.
Well, I'm just wondering why we're so insistent on trying to figure things out and leaving God out. Wouldn't it be so much easier to just say, okay, this is what it says in the Bible. We had the flood. That explains all this stuff. But we try to go through all this other explanation, scientific or whatever, that really doesn't make any sense.
The same reason that the thief never finds the police officer is the reason that the evolutionist never finds God. Because he's already discounted God in the answer. As he lays out his list of possible answers, God is not on the list. Something that God does is not on the list. God divinely stepping in and doing anything is not on the list. But I would argue as we read the Bible and then glance over at science, it's screaming there in line.
In one word, Satan.
Satan, yeah, thank you. The God of this world has darkened the minds of men. But now I want to go back to this, John, because I want to make sure, and y'all, I apologize, we're not even to our lesson yet. But I want to answer this question. Who's an engineer in this classroom?
14 people raise their
Jay, perfect. A guest who will not, a guest who will not care if he offends me or not. Okay, so imagine, Jay, that we have the mantle. And on top of that mantle, we have a mile of water. Let's just pretend. It has some weight, wouldn't you agree? And then 10 to 60 miles of crust. Now, that would have some weight. Now, nothing's sinking in and nothing's blowing out. They're at Equilibrium. What would happen if I were to just scoop down miles of crust and strip out all that water? The lower pressure would come up. What has been at equilibrium would bulge forth. My engineer explains to me exactly what is going to happen. The rock behind it would melt as it flooded in to equalize. That flooding in to equalize, the mid-oceanic ridge is the mountain that formed the continents, then sliding away with still some water underneath them. Everything was fine and at equilibrium until the crack started. And then we were headed for no equilibrium. Once that crack gets wide enough, the mantle is going to spring up, melting rock as it does, and create the mid-oceanic ridge. As the continents slide, they're going to slide until they either grind against the mantle or they run into the other side of the ridge. And look at the side that didn't run into the ridge, South America. We have this very narrow mountain chain. Look at the thickness of the mountain chain that ran up on the mid-oceanic ridge. This screams what happened. Once you see it. Once you see it. Pangea, shrinking Africa by 35%, eliminating Central America. No, that is not the answer. This is the answer. Okay, so check the video.
What does Pangea
So
mean?
Pangea is the belief that there was one supercontinent that was broken apart over time through plate tectonics, approximately 0.8 to 2 centimeters per year. That's like your fingernail grows. And it slowly tore the granite apart and slowly pushed it across. Now imagine this, and we gotta leave here because you guys gotta let me get to the Bible. I'll get in trouble with the pastor if I don't touch the Bible. If you went down to State Road 200 where it connects to the bridge, and you dug out a little trench, and you said, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna push State Road 200 about 10 feet. So you've got it cleared out. You can see the dirt. You can see State Road 200. It's about 6 inches thick, to say. You place your hands on there. You're a strong guy, Jay, and you begin to push. Well, let's assume you have enough force to push. Is State Road 200 going to move 10 feet? No. State Road 200 is going to begin to buckle and break. It may move a little, but it's going to crush, compact. It can't slide. The mantle is not silly putty. The mantle is not liquid. The mantle is solid. It's hot, but it's solid. Science tells us that. Continents can't slide across the mantle unless there was water below those continents. Then it was catastrophic plate tectonics. It's not 0.8 to 2 centimeters a year. It's not like your fingernail grows. It's catastrophic. It happens in a short order of days. And then when it does compress and crush when it grinds against the mantle, it does thrust up. It does create mountain ranges. The leading edge will do it. Take a sheet when you get home and lay it on the floor and just put something down there on the edge of it and push that sheet. When it hits that stuff that's you put out, what does it do? It buckles, just like we see the continents. You can reproduce them in your house this afternoon. The whole thing, what happened, you can see it. So hopefully, and again, I didn't mean to be this long, but I wanted to make sure that you and I were in the same place on the global catastrophe that is Noah's flood. It's much worse than you've ever imagined, and science screams it's true. I didn't need science. The Bible said it was true. I was done. But as a guy who has an interest here, science screams it's true. Anything else? We're going to get to, what I'll do is just read chapters or verses 1 through 7. That's where we ended last week. And I guess we will end there. I'll make some comments that I didn't make last week in preparation for next week. I've got 6 minutes, so we'll go a little bit further. Thank you, brother. He's extended me grace. All right, so let's read verses 1 through 7 to get us in context. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We talked about how this was in some ways a repetition from the Adamic blessing, but that one included the idea of subduing and bringing it under dominion. That's not the case anymore. Adam's given dominion away to Lucifer. Dominion is no longer an option for man. The God of this world has dominion. This has totally changed. Now look at verse 2. We see the change. God compensates. Instead of dominion and subduing, the fear of you and the dread of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the heavens and on everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish in the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Instead, to compensate, God builds within the animal kingdom a fear of man. Why doesn't the T-Rex run over right if it gets off the ark and do this? With Noah, God builds within the animal kingdom a fear that they did not have before. And equally, the T-Rex or whatever animal kind that was would have been relatively small, because God didn't bring the big ones, he brought the viable small ones. But that T-Rex or whatever the kind was is facing a tremendous uphill battle now, because the atmosphere has changed drastically and will continue to change over time. And man's going to hunt him as well, because he'll make a lot of Bronto burgers. So he's in for a rough ride. Verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. This is brand new. Man has only eaten vegetables to now. Man's been a vegetarian. I told the earlier class, do you wonder why there is an Outback Steakhouse? It's because of Genesis chapter 9 that there's an Outback Steakhouse. Otherwise, it would be the Outback Vegetarian House. But here, man is now authorized to eat food. Verse 4. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. Here, way before the giving of the Mosaic law, we see that man is commanded he can eat animals, he cannot consume blood. He cannot drink blood. He cannot eat blood. Well before this was part of the Mosaic law, it was part of the Noahic covenant, when God told Noah, do not consume blood. And for your life, I will require reckoning. For every beast I will require, and for man, from his fellow man, I will require reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For man was made in God's image. Now, what we didn't talk about last week that I now want to introduce to you, because last week we ended here, and so I didn't say it. Now I need to say it, although we're ending here again. There's some irony there. Theologians tell us that what we don't realize is that this is the introduction of the Noahic covenant. He hasn't said that yet. He's going to say it in the next verse. He's going to say, and this is the covenant that I make with you. But now when we read that next verse, we go, oh, wait, this was a covenant. So now let's begin to talk about the covenant. Man's responsibility to the covenant. Man's portion of the Noahic covenant. You remember what the first part was, the blessing part? Be fruitful and multiply. Part of the Noahic covenant was a redeclaring of what we saw in the garden, which was the marriage. And it's through marriage that the earth is to be procreated and recovered, repopulated. God is once again declaring marriage is the union that you will populate the earth. Go forth and populate the earth. He didn't mean, hey, have sex with each other and have babies. He meant, remember what I set up in the garden? Remember that holy institution? Replenish the earth. The second part, and then we'll go, after I get to the third, we're going to go to kitties. The second part is not to consume blood. So the second part of the Noahic covenant, well before the Mosaic covenant, man is not to consume blood. And then the third part of the Noahic covenant, well before the Mosaic covenant, man is not to murder, that's the Hebrew idea, man, and if he does, God will kill him. That is not what it says. Man will kill him. This is the first hint of the human institution of government. Here in Genesis 9, that man is to establish government. God is going to promise he's no longer, when things go sideways, he's not going to send a flood that will kill everything ever again. Instead, he's going to establish government as a method to help hold in check man's sinful nature until the Son of Man, the Lord Jesus Christ, comes, who people can believe in him and be born again. And he dwells in them and their hearts are changed. And all of a sudden, they're operating in a different way. But government will remain until he comes again at the end.
Be fruitful and multiply. And now we know that our population is decreasing. We are not going to be able to sustain our growth because our population is decreasing.
So the good news is, if you want this to be good news, is that man is not going to get to destroy man. Man is not going to get to destroy the planet. Man is not going to do any of that. That's God's doing. Final judgment belongs to God, and that day belongs to God. And we see the institution of marriage under attack, an institution that was reiterated here in Genesis 9. That was God's institution, reimagined here in Genesis 9, restated, and then we're going to go to my sister.
You can save the answer for next class if you want, because.
How much time do I have?
Um,
I'm out of time.
so I'm just a little confused. So how does this justify then God literally sending his people in to kill entire civilizations?
Great question.
How does that not contradict itself?
So keep in mind, and this is going to be developed over time, and there's a few points I want you to keep in mind. Number one, God is going to always condone murder, or not condone, but allow murder if the killing was accidental. That's not murder, that's accidental. God, through the nation of Israel, as he establishes government, is going to allow government to protect itself, right? So if I'm protecting myself and protecting my land, I'm allowed to kill. That's not murder. That's the government exercising its authority. We're going to see that God reserves the right to judge. And when a cup of a nation's sin starts to brim, he can bring judgment through any vehicle, whether that vehicle is the nation of Israel and their armies, or whether that vehicle is the cataclysm of the flood. God reserves the right to bring judgment through whatever vehicle he wants. And so in the Old Testament, we see God bringing judgment upon the Philistines, God bringing judgment on the Amorites. It's not arbitrary. We may read it and go, wow, he just got upset. No. What has been happening is they've been rejecting the knowledge of God, rejecting the knowledge of God, rejecting the knowledge of God. The cup of their iniquities brims, he responds, and judgment falls. And judgment can fall in a lot of different methods. I'm completely out of time. I was told to cut it off. I'm going to pray. That's what they gave me. I'm going to pray and we're going to go.